Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
It's wild, isn't it? Like 280 million people around the world dealing with depression.
Wow, that's a huge number.
It is, right. And you know what's even more striking? It's twice as common in women as it is in men.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, and get this, it's not like something that just pops up later in life either.
Well,
It's like this difference really starts to show during adolescence. It kind of makes you think, like what's going on biologically during those teenage years that could lead to such a big difference?
yeah, that's a fascinating question. And it's questions like that that drive the kind of research we're going to be talking about today.
Right on.
You see, we know quite a bit about, the social and psychological factors that can play a role in depression, especially for teenagers.
Uh-huh.
But today we're diving deep into a specific biological pathway in the brain.
Ooh, sounds complex.
It is a bit, but it's called the Kynurenine pathway.
Say that 5 times fast.
Kynurenine pathway.
I'm already tongue-tied.
Right. And what makes this even more interesting is that this is the first study I've come across that really takes a close look at this pathway specifically in adolescents.
Oh, wow.
And they're not just looking at the pathway itself, they're really trying to understand if there are any differences in it between boys and girls.
Makes sense.
Because it could potentially help explain why depression seems to hit girls harder during those teenage years.
Yeah, okay, so let's break this down a bit.
Sure.
Kynurenine pathway, for folks like you and me, that might sound like something straight out of a biology textbook.
It does, a little bit.
Can you walk us through it? Explain it in a way that even I can understand.
Absolutely. So think of it this way. It's like a process in the brain, right? And this process is all about breaking down an amino acid called tryptophan.
Tryptophan. That rings a bell.
It's something we get from our food.
Right, like turkey. Doesn't turkey make you sleepy because of tryptophan?
There you go.
See, I knew I'd learned something in school.
Exactly. So we get this tryptophan from food, and it goes through this Kynurenine pathway in the brain.
Uh-huh.
But here's the thing. It has a couple of different routes it can take. One of those routes leads to the creation of chemicals that are neuroprotective.
Neuroprotective. What's that mean?
It means they're basically like little bodyguards for your brain cells.
Okay, so they help keep the brain healthy.
Exactly. And one of the main products from this protective route is a chemical called kynurenic acid.
Kynurenic acid, the brain bodyguard.
You got it.
Okay, so that's the good side of the pathway. What about the other one?
Yes. Well, the other route, that's where things get a little bit trickier.
Oh,
It leads to the production of chemicals that can actually be neurotoxic.
neurotoxic, so the opposite of neuroprotective.
You got it.
So these are like the bad guys.
In a way, yeah, they can potentially damage brain cells. And one of the main byproducts here is quinolinic acid.
Okay, quinolinic acid, got it.
So basically, you've got this balancing act happening in the brain.
Right, the good guys versus the bad guys.
Yeah, tryptophan getting broken down to produce either the protective kynurenic acid or the potentially harmful quinolinic acid.
Makes sense. So this study focused on this balancing act,
Sure.
right? But what exactly were they trying to figure out? What was their mission?
They had a couple of big goals.
Okay.
First, they wanted to know if this kynurenine pathway has anything to do with depression in teenagers.
Like, are there any signs in this pathway that might show up in teens who are at risk for depression or who are already struggling with it?
Exactly. And the second goal, this was really important for understanding the difference between boys and girls.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to see if there were any differences in this pathway between teenage boys and girls that might explain why girls seem to be more prone to depression during those years.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then they also wanted to see if what they found in the pathway at the beginning of the study could actually predict how a teenager's depression would progress over time. Like, would it get better or would it stick around?
So like a crystal ball for depression almost.
Kinda, yeah. But it's important to remember that this whole biological angle doesn't mean that social and individual factors aren't important.
Right. It's all connected.
It all adds to the big picture.
So how did they actually do this study? Like, who are these teenagers and what did they have them do?
All right, so researchers from King's College London, they got together 150 teenagers from Brazil.
Brazil, huh?
Yeah, and all the teenagers were between 14 and 16 years old.
Right, in that sweet spot of adolescence.
Right, and they divided these teenagers into 3 groups, 50 in each.
Okay, and what were the groups?
So one group was considered low risk for depression.
Low risk, got it.
Another group was classified as high risk.
High risk, okay.
But this wasn't based on like a current diagnosis or anything.
So how did they figure out who was high risk?
They use a special tool called the Identifying Depression Early in Adolescence Risk Score, or IDEA Risk Score for short.
Idea risk score. Catchy.
Right. And this score looks at different social and demographic factors that we know are linked to a higher chance of developing depression.
Interesting.
And then the third group, these were teenagers who had already been diagnosed with major depressive disorder.
So they had 3 groups: low risk, high risk, and currently diagnosed.
Exactly. And this is really important for their research question. Each of the groups had an equal number of boys and girls.
Okay, that makes sense. So what did they actually do with these 3 groups of teens?
Well, they took blood samples from all 150 of them.
A little blood test.
Yep. And those blood tests let them measure the levels of those key chemicals we talked about earlier, the kynureninic acid, the neuroprotective one, and quinolinic acid, the potentially neurotoxic one.
Oh, right, the brain bodyguards and the not-so-friendly ones.
Exactly.
But they didn't stop there, did they?
Nope. They also measured other molecules involved in the kynurenine pathway.
To get a more complete picture.
And you know what else they measured? Inflammatory markers.
Inflammatory markers, what are those all about?
Good question. So these markers are basically signals in the blood, often proteins, and these signals increase when the body is dealing with inflammation.
Inflammation, like when you get a cut and it gets all red and swollen?
That's one type, but inflammation can also be caused by things like infections, stress, even just being sick.
I see. So they wanted to know if there was a connection between these inflammation markers and the kynurenine pathway?
Exactly, because there's growing evidence that inflammation might be linked to depression.
Wow, so many pieces to this puzzle.
I know, right? And then the last piece, for the 50 teenagers who had already been diagnosed with depression at the start of the study, they tracked them for 3 years to see if their depression was still there or if it had gone away.
Oh, wow, so they followed them long term.
Yep, and 41 of them finished the whole follow-up.
So they're looking at the blood levels at the start and then seeing what happens to these teenagers over time.
Exactly.
Okay, so what did they find out? What were the big discoveries?
Okay, so one of the most important things they found was that the teenagers who were either at higher risk for depression or who already had it, they had lower levels of kynureninic acid.
The brain bodyguard.
Yep, compared to the teens who were at low risk.
Interesting.
But here's where it gets even more interesting.
Oh, I love when it gets interesting.
This reduction in kynureninic acid was most noticeable in the girls.
Really?
It was like the girls were really driving this finding.
So lower levels of the protective chemical. And it's especially true for girls at risk or already dealing with depression.
That seems like a big clue, doesn't it?
It does, right.
What else did they find?
They also looked at the ratio between kynureninic acid and quinolinic acid.
Okay, remind me what those are again.
So kynureninic acid, that's the good guy, the protective one. And quinolinic acid is the one that can be harmful.
Right. So they looked at the ratio. Why?
Well, a higher ratio would basically mean there's a better balance towards protecting the brain.
While a lower ratio might mean things are leaning more towards the potentially harmful stuff.
Okay, got it. So what did they find about the ratio?
They found that the teens who were either at high risk or already had depression, they had a lower ratio of kynureninic acid to quinolinic acid compared to the low-risk group.
So not only were they low on the good stuff, but the balance was off too.
That's right, and guess what? This imbalance was, again, more obvious in the girls.
Wow, so the girls are really showing some distinct patterns here. What about those inflammatory markers? Did they connect those to anything?
They did, and it's really interesting.
Okay, tell me.
They found that the higher those inflammatory markers were in the blood, the more those neurotoxic chemicals were being produced in the kynurenine pathway.
It's more of the harmful stuff.
Exactly.
But was this true for all the teens?
No, this connection was mainly seen in the high-risk and depressed groups. The low-risk group didn't really show this pattern. So it seems like inflammation might be playing a role in pushing that pathway towards producing more of those brain-damaging chemicals.
And potentially increasing the risk of depression.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay, so maybe inflammation is like a trigger that messes with the balance in the pathway.
That's one way to think about it, yeah.
Wow, so many layers to this.
Right, and then remember how they followed that group who was already diagnosed with depression?
Yeah, for 3 years.
Well, they found that the girls whose depression stuck around.
Meaning you didn't go away?
Yeah, they had higher levels of those neurotoxic metabolites way back at the beginning of the study.
Compared to the girls whose depression went into remission, right?
Exactly.
So basically, high levels of the potentially harmful chemicals early on could be a sign that depression might stick around longer for teenage girls.
Seems like it. Yeah,
This is all really fascinating stuff.
it is, right?
Okay, so if we put all these findings together, what do they really tell us about depression in teenagers, especially girls?
Well, this study really points to the idea that the kynurenine pathway is involved in how depression develops during adolescence.
It's not just some random pathway, it's playing a part,
Right, and what's really important for understanding why girls are more affected.
which is what we started with, that big question.
Exactly. Well, those findings that were specific to females, the lower levels of the protective kynurenic acid and that more obvious imbalance in the pathway, those things might actually explain biologically why teenage girls are more likely to experience depression.
It's like there's a vulnerability in this pathway for girls during this time.
That's exactly what it seems like.
Okay, so we're getting closer to understanding that initial statistic.
We are, yeah. But, of course, more research is always needed.
Of course, always more to learn. But could this research, like practically speaking, lead to anything that could help teenagers with depression? Like down the line, is there any potential here?
Absolutely, and this is where it gets really exciting, I think.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Because the researchers found these differences in the kynurenine pathway, it opens up possibilities for identifying teens, especially girls, who might be at risk for long-lasting depression.
Oh, so like a way to predict who might struggle more.
Yeah, and it could be as simple as a blood test to measure these chemicals,
Wow, that would be amazing.
wouldn't it? And then, if we understand this pathway better, we might be able to develop new treatments that are more targeted.
Targeted how?
Well, imagine medications that specifically address this imbalance in the pathway.
Oh, that's interesting.
Or even just lifestyle changes, like maybe tweaking your diet or getting more exercise, could help shift the balance in the pathway.
That's a totally different way of looking at depression, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's not just about how you feel or think. It's about these biological processes happening in the brain.
And that link with inflammation, that seems important too.
It's huge, yeah.
It's like a whole other avenue to explore.
Definitely. Maybe by reducing inflammation, we could actually have a positive effect on mental health.
By influencing this pathway.
Exactly.
This all sounds really promising, but I know every study has its limitations.
True.
What are some things we should keep in mind when we're thinking about these findings?
Okay, so one thing is that they only measured the levels of these chemicals in blood plasma.
Right, not in the brain itself.
Exactly. And while blood levels can give us some clues, it would be even better to measure those levels directly in the cerebrospinal fluid.
That's the fluid around the brain and spinal cord, right?
You got it.
Makes sense. Blood levels are a good starting point, but direct brain measurements would give us an even clearer picture.
Absolutely.
Were there any other limitations in this study?
Yeah, there was actually one neuroprotective chemical they couldn't measure.
One of the good guys.
Yeah, it's called picolinic acid.
Okay,
So we don't know how that particular chemical played into everything.
makes sense.
And then another thing to consider is that while 150 participants is a decent sample size, when you start breaking it down into smaller groups, like looking at boys and girls separately, it does, and that can make it harder to be super confident in the results.
So bigger studies are needed to really confirm these findings and see if they hold true for a wider range of people.
Exactly.
Okay, so this study gives us a really good foundation, but more research is definitely needed to build on it. What did the experts who did this study have to say about all of this?
Well, Professor Valeria Mondelli, she's one of the lead researchers on this project.
Okay.
She emphasized that adolescence is this really crucial period for brain development.
Lots of changes happening.
And we're still learning about how all the biological stuff contributes to depression, especially when it comes to those differences between boys and girls.
Right, there's still a lot we don't know.
And she's really hopeful that by understanding these biological pathways better, we'll be able to find clearer and more effective ways to help teenagers manage depression.
That's what it's all about, right? Finding ways to help.
Absolutely. And then Dr. Nagma Nikaslat, she was the first author of the study. She pointed out that measuring these kynurenine pathway chemicals could be a way to identify teens, especially girls, who might be at higher risk of having their depression become a long-term problem.
Oh, like a warning system almost.
Yeah, exactly. And she also talked about how exciting it would be to develop interventions that directly target this pathway.
So not just understanding it, but actually doing something about it.
Right, whether that's through medications or even lifestyle changes.
It's like opening up a whole new world of possibilities.
I think so, yeah. But it's also important to remember that this study is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right. It doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Exactly. The researchers themselves pointed out that while the kynurenine pathway has been studied in adults with depression,
Uh-huh.
their study is really important because it focuses specifically on adolescents, which is when depression often first appears.
Right. It's a critical time.
And the fact that they looked at sex differences specifically within this age group, that's something new and really important.
It fills a gap in our knowledge.
And they also emphasize that it's crucial to study these biological mechanisms in teenagers all over the world, especially in low and middle income countries.
Because that's where most of the world's teens live.
Exactly. So it has huge global implications.
Wow. So much to think about.
Right. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a thought.
Okay, hit me with it.
What do you think all of this means for how we understand why teenage girls seem to be more vulnerable to depression? Could we maybe in the future use these biological markers, like the ones in the kynurenine pathway, alongside the psychological and social assessments we already do?
To identify and maybe even prevent depression in teens.
Exactly. And what about lifestyle and diet? Could we find specific ways to support a healthy balance in this pathway through the things we eat and how we live, especially during those teenage years?
That's a really powerful idea.
Isn't it? It shows how everything is connected. Our biology, our environment, our mental health.
It's all intertwined.
Exactly. It's all part of the bigger picture.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive. Lots to ponder, that's for sure.
Fascinating.
Thanks for breaking it all down for us.
It's been my pleasure.
Until next time, folks, keep those brains curious.
And those minds open.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.